Good evening. I hope this message finds you in a moment of calm, because what you're about to hear is anything but calm. It begins in the kind of darkness that normally swallows sound, movement, even tension itself. A convoy of foreign mercenaries, silent and disciplined, slipped toward the borders of Burkina Faso like shadows hunting for a crack in the continent's armor. They moved with the absolute conviction that they were invisible, that their approach would go undetected until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. But here's the first shock that should rattle anyone paying attention. They were never invisible, not for a single second. From the moment these vehicles crossed that threshold into ECOWAS territory, Ibrahim Traoré's radar systems painted them in bright, unforgiving red. Every vehicle, every signal, every breath of their engines was tracked with precision that would make any Western intelligence agency pause and reconsider their assumptions about African military capabilities. In a world that has grown comfortable underestimating Africa, this alone would be enough to change the conversation. But this is where the story takes a turn so sharp it should concern anyone watching global affairs unfold. The deeper Traoré looked into this convoy, the more he realized something fundamental didn't match NATO's standard operational playbook. It looked like NATO on the surface. It moved with formations that resembled NATO tactics. But something inside the structure, something in the details, simply didn't belong. And that's where the true shock begins to crystallize. Because if this mission was deliberately designed to appear NATO-controlled while not actually being under NATO command, then someone out there was constructing a trap meant to explode from the inside out. A trap that could push Burkina Faso, the entire Sahel region, and potentially even Western powers into a crisis that no one saw coming and few would understand once it arrived. This isn't just an infiltration attempt that got caught. This is a setup layered underneath another setup, an agenda hiding behind a flag that was never supposed to be questioned by those watching from the outside. If what Traoré detected is accurate, and every indication suggests it is, then Africa didn't just avoid a military attack that night. It avoided a geopolitical chain reaction that was engineered from shadows by actors who never intended to show their faces. The operation began long before the mercenaries ever touched the edge of Burkina Faso's territory. Somewhere far from the Sahel, perhaps in a boardroom, perhaps in a bunker, perhaps in one of those places where decisions are made without signatures or official records, someone drafted a plan wrapped in silence. A plan built on the arrogant belief that Africa still sleeps at night, that African nations still react rather than anticipate, that leaders like Traoré would be caught off guard and forced into responses they hadn't calculated. The entire scheme depended on one critical assumption, that Ibrahim Traoré would not see it coming. That assumption was the first and perhaps most fatal mistake these architects made. Because as the convoy crept through the outer corridors of the ECOWAS region, Traoré's early warning systems didn't just detect movement in the way a basic radar might. These systems recognize patterns with the sophistication of artificial intelligence combined with human strategic thinking, not just heat signatures, but formation geometry that revealed training and doctrine. Not just radio pulses, but frequency drift inconsistencies that exposed the difference between authentic military communications and sophisticated imitations. These were details that only someone who had studied Western proxy operations for months with surgical precision would catch. And Traoré had studied them exactly that way, with the focus of a surgeon preparing for the moment a hidden tumor finally shows itself and can be addressed. The first thing his analysts noticed was the spacing between the vehicles as they moved in convoy formation. Too tight for standard NATO doctrine in some sections, too loose for private contractors trained strictly under US or French military influence in others. It was something deliberately in between, something carefully imperfect, as if someone wanted the operation to look Western enough to be recognizable, but not so perfectly Western that it would be easy to trace back to specific units or command structures. A forgery disguised as authenticity, designed to fool observers who weren't looking closely enough. Then came the second anomaly that made analysts in the command center exchange uneasy glances. The call and response radio bursts were coded and encrypted certainly, but the rhythm was fundamentally wrong. Western military units communicate with a familiar cadence that's been shaped by decades of joint training exercises and standardized tactical culture that creates almost unconscious patterns. This group spoke like outsiders who had studied the language but were imitating insiders, close enough to fool the unprepared or those who wanted to believe what they were seeing, but not close enough to deceive a military mind that had been sharpened by years of watching foreign influence crawl around the Sahel like a patient predator. Inside the Ouagadougou Command Center, officers exchanged glances heavy with implications. One of them approached Traoré quietly and said with careful precision, "Sir, the encryption key structure is similar to NATO operational units, but there's a significant mismatch in the modulation patterns. It looks copied." That one word, copied, changed everything in the room. The temperature seemed to drop as everyone processed what that meant. Because a copied signature means something far more dangerous than a straightforward NATO incursion, which would at least be clear in its intentions and origins. It means an incursion pretending to be NATO, an attack designed not just to invade territory, but to mislead observers, to provoke specific reactions, to manipulate the political fault lines that run through West Africa like seismic cracks waiting for pressure. Traoré understood instantly that this was not simply a mission with military objectives. This was a message, a communication designed to create chaos that someone else could then interpret and exploit for purposes that remained hidden behind layers of misdirection. He ordered his officers to map the convoy's projected trajectory with maximum detail. The results were deeply unsettling. The route had been engineered with precision to hit one of the few border sectors where an infiltration could spark a chain reaction of confusion among international observers who were monitoring the region. A single gunshot in that location, a single confrontation between forces, a single casualty that made headlines could ignite a diplomatic fire aimed not at Burkina Faso specifically, but at the fragile alliances that were forming across Africa as nations sought to reduce their dependence on external military partnerships. If Traoré had panicked in that moment, if he had reacted the way a frightened or inexperienced leader might, the trap would have worked exactly as designed. The architects of this scheme would have won before the first mercenary actually crossed the borderline. But Traoré didn't panic. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes cold and focused, voice steady as granite. "Track them," he said quietly. "Do not engage. Not yet." His officers hesitated, because this wasn't the usual protocol they'd been trained to follow. Standard defensive doctrine would call for immediate defensive positioning and potential engagement to prevent border violations. But Traoré wasn't following a manual written by someone else. He was following instinct that had been forged by surviving in a world where Africa's enemies often wear the faces of friends and speak the language of partnership while undermining sovereignty. As the convoy approached the second detection ring that Burkina Faso's intelligence network had established, another layer of the plot revealed itself with disturbing clarity. The engine signatures of the vehicles had been modified in ways that made no sense for pure operational efficiency. These weren't standard NATO engines running on NATO fuel with NATO maintenance protocols. They weren't modified Russian engines either, which would have suggested a different set of actors. They were something hybrid, built with parts sourced from multiple countries in a configuration that sacrificed some performance for the sake of obscuring origin. This was the kind of setup used by covert units that were meant to hide who built them, rather than optimize their battlefield effectiveness. "Someone wants us to believe this is NATO," one analyst murmured while studying the data. "But someone else doesn't want NATO to know we believe that," another analyst replied with a troubled expression. A silence heavier than gunfire settled over the command room. Because this wasn't just an infiltration that got detected. This wasn't just a provocation that could be managed through standard diplomatic channels. This was a double-blind operation. An attack hidden inside another attack. A deception wrapped inside another deception, like Russian nesting dolls designed to confuse everyone who tried to understand what was really happening. The deeper the intelligence team dug into the technical details, the stranger the picture became. Satellite imagery analysis showed the convoy using outdated camouflage patterns that NATO hadn't employed in over a decade. Patterns that would be recognized by anyone familiar with military equipment, but were no longer current enough to definitively prove active NATO involvement. Their side-mounted signal dampeners were third-generation models, technology that NATO had abandoned years ago in favor of more sophisticated electronic warfare systems. Whoever had equipped this group did so with gear that whispered NATO to casual observers, but shouted one thing louder to anyone looking carefully: plausible deniability. By the time the mercenaries reached within 20 kilometers of the actual border, Traoré had confirmed the truth he had already sensed from the beginning. This operation was built to look Western in origin, but it was not designed to succeed as a military operation in any conventional sense. It was engineered to succeed politically when things went wrong, and going wrong appeared to be the actual point of the entire exercise. Someone wanted Burkina Faso to lash out without thinking. Someone wanted NATO to be blamed for destabilization they didn't authorize. Someone wanted chaos to erupt so they could benefit from the resulting confusion and international intervention that would follow. But instead of chaos, these architects found Traoré calm and calculating, absolutely unshakable in his composure. He stood in front of the live surveillance feed, watching the convoy's movements with the patience of someone who understood he was playing a different game than his opponents expected. When he spoke, his tone made every person in the command center straighten their backs and pay complete attention. "We are not responding to the vehicles," he said with deliberate emphasis. "We are responding to the mind behind them." His officers stared at him, momentarily confused by the distinction he was making. Traoré continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't an invasion designed to take territory. It's a test, and whoever designed it wants to see exactly how we react before they reveal their real face and their real intentions." The implication sent chills across the room as people processed what he was suggesting. If this convoy was the fake operation, the visible layer meant to draw attention and provoke response, then what was the real operation hiding behind it? If these mercenaries were only the front layer of a multi-stage plan, what was concealed in the layers beneath them? The convoy kept advancing through the darkness, completely unaware that every inch of their movement was being broadcast into the analytical mind of a leader who had already decoded the trap they were walking into, and the entire nation could feel it. There was a quiet tension spreading through communities, a simmering readiness that moved through villages and cities, a collective breath held in anticipation of what might come next. But Burkina Faso wasn't the prey that night. It had become the mirror, and someone watching from far away was about to see their own reflection staring back at them with unexpected clarity. The tension inside the command center sharpened as the convoy pushed deeper into the outer perimeter zones. Every officer in that room felt it. Not panic or fear, but the unmistakable gravity of a situation that had been engineered with surgical precision by people who understood geopolitical pressure points. Something about the formation, something about the pacing, something about the calculated periods of radio silence between communication bursts. None of it behaved like a typical hostile infiltration conducted by mercenaries or even professional military units. It behaved like a demonstration, and demonstrations are never meant for the target alone. They're meant for the audience, watching from multiple locations, interpreting events through their own biases and strategic interests. Traoré knew this instinctively. His fingertips brushed the edge of the operations table as he absorbed every flicker on the radar display, every data point his systems generated. "They want us to strike first," he murmured. And you could practically hear the oxygen freeze in the room as people processed the implications. Because if Burkina Faso struck too early, before the full picture was clear, the architects of this operation could point to that military action and tell the world, "You see, the Sahel is unstable and aggressive. International intervention is required for regional security." If Burkina Faso waited too long and allowed the mercenaries to penetrate deeper into sovereign territory, they could force a staged confrontation at a location of their choosing and blame the resulting chaos on African aggression or the unpredictability of militant groups operating without proper state control. Every possible path forward was a trap. Every potential reaction had been scripted in advance by whoever designed this operation, unless someone had the wisdom and courage to refuse to play the game according to rules written by someone else. Across West Africa, intelligence networks were buzzing with activity. Mali, Niger, Guinea, all monitoring the situation closely, all confused by aspects of what they were seeing, all sensing a pressure spreading through the region like a silent tide that threatened to sweep away the fragile stability these nations had fought to build. Each of these countries had tasted foreign manipulation before. They knew intimately what orchestration by external powers felt like, what patterns it followed, what warning signs preceded intervention dressed up as humanitarian assistance or security partnerships. And yet something about this particular attempt felt fundamentally different, more calculated in its layers, more sophisticated in its misdirection, more desperate in its execution, as if whoever designed it was running out of time or options. In Washington, a retired U.S. intelligence officer watching the situation unfold from his quiet office reportedly muttered to a colleague, "This isn't NATO's operational fingerprint. This is someone trying to borrow NATO's fingerprint for purposes NATO doesn't know about." He compared it to forging someone's signature on a document, not to steal money from their account, but to start a conflict between two parties who were never meant to fight each other in the first place, leaving the forger to benefit from the chaos that resulted. And on the ground in Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was shifting in ways that cameras couldn't capture, but people could feel in their bones. Villagers living near the border regions noticed birds fleeing from the horizon in patterns that suggested something unnatural approaching. Hunters who knew the land intimately reported a tremor in the earth that didn't come from the vehicle engines themselves, but from the way soldiers around them moved, tense yet controlled, like a massive organism inhaling as one in preparation for action. Local elders whispered among themselves that the land itself was reacting to what approached, that the spirits of ancestors who had defended this soil before were restless, that this moment carried weight beyond what outsiders could understand. Inside the command center, the first truly paradigm-shifting shock arrived. A secondary transmission, weak and scrambled, almost buried completely inside background electromagnetic noise, suddenly surfaced on the monitoring spectrum. At first glance, it looked like ordinary interference, the kind of signal chaos that happens in regions with multiple military and civilian systems operating simultaneously. Then one of the younger analysts enhanced the signal using filtering techniques, and the entire room went rigid. It was a communications signal meant specifically for the mercenary convoy. But critically, it wasn't coming from their supposed commanders or any obvious chain of command structure. Someone else entirely was communicating with them, someone not listed in any organizational chart that intelligence had been able to construct for this operation. The message itself was remarkably short, just 3 words that appeared on the screen. But those 3 words detonated the truth like an explosive charge that had been hidden underneath everything they thought they understood. Proceed. Trigger pressure. Officers stared at the screen, trying to process what they were reading. What kind of military directive uses that phrasing? Not attack your objective. Not infiltrate and secure. Not withdraw to secondary position. Trigger pressure. It was a phrase that only made sense if the actual goal wasn't military victory or territorial control, but deliberate escalation. A phrase that only made sense if the operation's true purpose was to bait Burkina Faso into a larger geopolitical confrontation that would serve someone else's strategic interests. A phrase that hinted at a puppeteer, someone pulling strings behind units that were pretending to operate under NATO authority while actually serving an agenda that remained hidden in shadows. That was the precise moment when Traoré's eyes changed in a way everyone in the room noticed. They didn't widen with shock. They didn't show panic or confusion. They hardened with the cold clarity of someone who had just confirmed their darkest suspicion. "This is not NATO," he said quietly but with absolute conviction. "This is someone trying to make it look like NATO while hiding behind the chaos that follows." And suddenly, like a puzzle where the final piece clicks into place and reveals the complete picture, the whole operation snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. This wasn't incompetence or miscommunication or coincidence. This was deliberate design by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate perceptions and exploit assumptions. The altered engine signatures that obscured origin, the outdated camouflage patterns that provided just enough distance from current NATO standards. The semi-copied encryption protocols that looked authentic to casual observation, the unnatural pacing and movement patterns, the mismatched radio communication rhythms, and now a command phrase that no Western-trained military unit would ever use in operational communications. It all formed a web inside a web, a shadow concealed inside another shadow, an operation created specifically to spark rage and violence, while hiding the hands that lit the match and set the fire. Tell me now, where are you watching this unfold from? Because what happens next will redefine how we understand power, manipulation, and resistance in Africa. Your voice matters in this conversation. Subscribe so you never miss the next revelation in this story that's still unfolding.